In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Magazine and Sublation Media viewers and readers. I'm Douglas Lain. With me today is Cyber Dandy. I am the author of Bash Bash Revolution. I like to mention that every time. I'm the new teacher of the research project Realist Writers Workshop. It's a lot of words, but running that for free here in Portland and online through the Patreon. So if you are interested in learning or improving your writing and doing so in the service of socialism, please do join up on the Patreon. And Jared, introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jared. I go by Cyber Dandy for some of the projects I do online. I've been on the show or other shows that Douglas has worked on in the past, and I have my own website, cyberdandy.org, have my own channel on YouTube. I come from an anarchist background, so tend to have a little bit of a different view than other sublation guests. And that about
Yeah,
sums it up.
I like to get Jared on so I can get in touch with my roots. To begin with, I'll just throw this on the screen. It says, so wait, sublation is just a Zionist now? I guess that's in response to the thumbnail that I put up where I used the Star of David. And no, wait, I didn't do that. I I put up a thumbnail. Let's see if I can bring it up on the screen here. Which had a picture of this pro-Palestinian and Palestinian protester at Columbia. He was a leader of the protest movement there. And let's see if I can find it so I can share it. Let's see here. But yeah, it says free speech for secret agents. That's the title of this piece. I'm not finding the thumbnail right now. But in any case, no, we are not Zionist. We of course oppose the. Oh, here it is. We oppose the invasion and the massacre and the occupation in Gaza and the West Bank. Here's the thumbnail. Oh, let's see. That's making it a background. So anyway, no. And you're being a butthead to ask that question. It's jumping to conclusions and unfairly interpreting the channel. So anyhow, I do have though. I'm going to put. I took away the background that we wanted. I do have. Here's the thumbnail. I do have an essay that I wrote this morning on the topic of secret agents and free speech. And I thought I might read that to you, Jared, if you can put up with me doing so for a bit. And then we can kind of debate the topic and discuss how the left should approach the state under Trump. So here's what I have. So after Jacob Siegel published an essay called A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, he spoke about the essay with his co-host Phil Clay on the Manifesto podcast, and Clay objected that Siegel, having claimed that the Democratic Party saw itself as a uniparty and had been working to construct a new political order that operated beyond and below the bounds of the old decrepit constitutional order, one that was specifically aiming at overcoming the First Amendment, Clay claimed that that this was hyperbolic, that it was too much. He was being a bit hysterical. But Siegel insisted that within a few years, liberal elites who were dismissive or in denial about his thesis would come around to his perspective and even claim that it was just a truism. It would become commonplace or received opinion amongst the educated classes, he said. So I think that we are very close to that moment where The idea that we've gone beyond the First Amendment, that there's a new order that it goes beyond the constitutional order, might be, we're right up on that moment where that opinion is a received opinion. The question now, after the defeat of the Uniparty, is to what degree will Trump maintain the apparatus that the Uniparty left behind? And if he did so, what would someone like Jacob Siegel think? Siegel is an editor at Tablet Magazine, and after the first attempted assassination of Trump, an op-ed ran in Tablet Magazine, wherein the editorial board, I think, evoked Hegel's description of Napoleon as history on horseback and compared Trump to the emperor. Here's the quote from Hegel. I saw the emperor, this world's soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. This extraordinary man, whom it is impossible not to admire. So, let me see if I lost my place there for a second. But okay, here it is. But here's the thing: the task for Trump after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, and now after he's been elected, is to reach out over the world and master it. But like any other Bonapartist, he's facing a world run through and by contradictions, a world mediated by labor time and set up to create systems of reification in order to perpetuate itself. It wants to perpetuate itself in its current form today and into the future. The Frankfurt School Marxist Theodor Adorno called this process of reification the culture industry. In 1947, he described it this way: it is a result not of a law of movement in technology as such, but as its function in today's economy. The need which might resist central control has already been suppressed by the control of the individual consciousness. The step from the telephone to the radio has clearly distinguished the roles. The former still allowed the subscriber to play the role of the subject and was liberal. The latter is democratic. It turns all participants into listeners and authoritatively subjects them to broadcast programs which are all exactly the same. No machinery of rejoinder has been devised, and private broadcasters are denied any freedom. Roughly 20 years later, after that, in 1968, the French Marxist Guy Debord called this culture industry the spectacle, and then 20 years after that, he added the word integrated to the term, christening our world as the integrated spectacle. In 1988, Usenet was about a decade old. It was the first killer app of the internet. It was thought to be a liberalizing technology. It was as if your landline phone could be used like a radio, only in print. The internet, built by the U.S. Defense Department through ARPA, made it possible for everyone to participate in the culture industry. This liberalization came with an opposite injunction. If everyone was going to be allowed to speak with everyone else, then everyone's ideas would need to be produced under the strictest supervision. Debord described how centralized authority could still dominate under these conditions. The integrated spectacular shows itself to be simultaneously concentrated and diffuse. As regards the concentrated side, the controlling center has now become a cult, never to be occupied by a known leader or clear ideology. And on the diffuse side, the spectacular influence has never before put its mark to such a degree on almost the totality of socially produced behavior and objects. Debord pointed out that in the 20th century spectacle, there still remained nothing that was not transformed by industry, nothing that wasn't guided by the interests of the ruling class as mediated through the state. He wrote, "The government of the spectacle, which now possesses all the means to falsify the whole of production and perception, is the absolute master of memories, just as it is the unfettered master of projects that will shape the most distant future. It reigns unchecked. It executes its summary judgments." And I'll say a little more about Debord. Debord went on to say that in the age of ARPANET, what mattered most was one's mediatic status rather than one's actual abilities. He was thinking as much about the power of television and radio as about the old forms of the culture industry, as much about the old forms of the culture industry as he was about the new digital spectacle. But given how the digital media was developed and run through the Defense Department, what he said about the old analog instruments applies equally well to their digital cousins. The newly liberalized digital media would provide cover for many enterprises, officially independent, but in fact secretly linked by various ad hoc networks. It would operate in baroque and complicated ways. One could publish a novel in order to arrange an assassination. He wrote, "The greatest ambition of the integrated spectacular was that secret agents become revolutionaries, and that revolutionaries become secret agents. What he didn't say then, but might say now, is that these secret agent revolutionaries would also become social media influencers, or in any case, that they would become internet celebrities." This is all my lead up to informing you of the fact that Mahmoud Khalil, the pro-Palestinian movement's Mario Savio at Columbia, is and was a kind of British agent. That is, which is to say, how can Trump, a 20th century TV star who learned a new trick in the 21st century on Twitter, be a Napoleonic figure today, but for taking up the reins of the integrated spectacular? Also, should he be understood? Also, should we understand that as revolutionaries, we've all been integrated into the state, into the global intelligence community, even if not always formally? I've been arguing for the last 2 years that the left must take the First Amendment seriously, and I still believe that wholeheartedly. However, if we're to regain the First Amendment, it is now clear that we not only have to roll back the Patriot Act, the legislation that allows Trump to deport Mahmoud on the basis of political speech, but we should also work to uncover the degree to which our own rebellions are already fit into the culture industry, the spectacle, the intelligence community. We should understand that we may already be secret agents. Are we all like the protagonist of the Philip K. Dick novel, A Scanner Darkly? That is, are we all of us already our own cops, even as we rebel? Are we all reporting on ourselves? We must defend Mahmoud's free speech rights, even though he worked for a British soft power operation in Beirut. We should work to expose the tentacles of the intelligence communities around the world that have been directing our rebellions by controlling our thinking and strategies, shaping us through the universities, through the NGOs, and through state-funded scholarships like the one Khalil managed, the Chevening program, and soft power operations like the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which Mahmoud Khalil also worked on for the UK Foreign Office back in 2020. The question is this: how can we kill off the censorship industrial complex before Trump can make it great again if we are working for it ourselves? So that's my essay.
All
What do
right.
you what do you make?
Well, that's a lot to unpack. Fortunately, a lot of it we're on the same page with, so I don't have to dig into it a whole lot.
Yeah.
I think, I kind of went the same direction when I started thinking about this in preparation, where I wanted to start off by thinking about what is the state under Donald Trump and his regime. And the best term that I could think of to describe it is corporate nationalism, even though that's easy to confuse with fascist corporatism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm using it in a different way because the way that Trump is running things is kind of like he's the CEO and he wants to, it's called the unitary executive theory or model. He
Mm-hmm.
wants to consolidate power into the executive under him. But the way he wants to actually use that power is through privatized means. So he basically wants private sector competition to win his approval, right? So you see
Can you
him,
give me an example of that?
yeah.
Um,
So when it comes to immigration, we have, we see him trying to privatize parts of ICE and use more private prisons or whatever you want to call them. Um,
Hmm.
but just in general, the way that he uses tariffs, the way that he uh, approaches funding for other public institutions, he weaponizes revenue and sort of uses it like a CEO would to reward those who are loyal to him. But he allows for that competition to happen, right? Whereas
Hmm.
under like a real fascist corporate model, you would have control over all that and it wouldn't be a competitive model.
Well,
So,
okay. So I want to let you finish. I have some thoughts about what you're saying, but I don't want to interrupt. I am interrupting, but I don't want to. So keep going.
well, I was going to say, so that's more like the form of the government, not really the content. And I think the content is more along the lines of like muscular Christianity, where it's sort of this like promotion of the masculine Christian kind of ideal. And that's a separate sort of thing where you bring in all the Christian nationalists and all that, but it's still within this overarching model of running the state like a corporation.
Hmm. Okay. Well, let's talk about the unitary executive idea, and let's talk about this notion of Christian nationalism. I think that you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's no doubt that Trump is attempting to accomplish a unitary executive. This is a goal that Dick Cheney had as well. It's been around for a long time. From a certain point of view, it's been around since the founding of the federal government. It's been around since the Constitution was signed. You can read about the role of the executive in the Hamilton Papers,
Right,
and it was decided that rather than having a council run the executive branch of government, one unitary executive would
right,
run the executive branch, and this was offset by the division of powers, the separation of powers in the federal government. So the executive would be checked not by another part of the executive in the council, but by the legislative and judiciary and in the judicial branches. And um, that's the constitutional order, roughly, in a sketch. And what developed in the 20th century was a kind of permanent administrative segment of the executive that,
hmm,
to greater and greater degree, was outside of and independent of the executive himself or herself. Whoever would be elected president would only be able to direct the operations of the administrative bureaucracy to a limited degree, supposedly. But there were ways in which that administrative state was a political football between the two parties that were competing with each other. So, um, just as an example of that, um, in the 80s and 70s and 80s, the Democrats tried to use the judiciary to limit the power and authority of the executive branches agencies through the judiciary in order to defend what they said were the public's interests. Um, so they would sue regulatory agencies when they were not adequately interpreting the regulations and laws that have been passed. So the laws that have been passed by the Congress, and also the laws and rules that the agencies had come up with themselves. Um, the Chevron decision in 1984, I think, in the Supreme Court, put it into that to a large degree because it was decided that the agencies themselves would have the authority and power to interpret the law or regulations rather than the courts, especially when it came to the regulations they had themselves come up with. Um, that was undone again last year by the Supreme Court and returning the power to interpret the administrative agency's regulations to the courts. Um, But what is happening now is that Trump is attempting to take control of all of the agencies interpreting the regulations through the executive branch and through the executive himself, through the presidency, and through the attorney general. So now, rather than these agencies having an independent role interpreting their own regulations, the president and the attorney general will be determining what the regulations will be, or
Mhm.
to the degree that they can, that they're not being given to by the Congress. In other words, the regulations that will play a part in the execution of the law, in the execution of the policies of the state. Those regulations will be set by the president. Now, that's what it means to have a unitary executive. It doesn't mean that the president is usurping the role of the Congress or the courts. It just means
Right.
that the executive agencies are going to be under the president's control and no longer thought to be independent, which is a huge change. It goes against the whole idea of the administrative state, as I understand it, in Woodrow Wilson's day. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm not a big fan of Woodrow Wilson or the administrative state either. So I kind of shrug at the whole affair.
Yeah.
Uh, Go ahead.
There's, I mean, we could get into pros and cons of that. I think,
Hmm.
and it's not really, this doesn't really begin with Trump, this consolidation of power, right? I mean, we saw similar stuff under Obama and whatever. But I think really when we want to talk about what's unique, it's this kind of market fundamentalism in the way that power is exercised. And it's also sort of the pitting of the nationalist priority versus the globalist priority. And
Well,
this
yeah,
is where I think, yeah,
those two things are kind of at odds with each other, right? On the one hand, you have tariffs and regulations and attempts to protect the national interests as opposed to leaving it in a kind of a supposedly quasi deregulated global market. And on the other hand, you do want to incentivize innovation and competition, at least domestically. I want to throw a couple of comments up here from Spencer Leonard. He says the
yeah,
unitary executive theory means civilian authority over the state.
which
Um,
is interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And then he also says it really has nothing to do with the question of legislation by the executive, i.e., government by executive order. And that's true too. And I didn't mean to imply that it did. It had to do with who had the power to interpret the regulations in the agencies and in order to execute on them.
And
Um,
and selectively execute on legislation, which I think is going to be really important when we get to this the free speech
yeah,
stuff.
we got to get to the
Yeah.
free speech stuff soon because that's really the key here. And I want to get to that and also get to the question of the degree to which the left's own political projects, or the ones that they think of as their own, are not their own. Are being
Yeah.
set up by outside powers from foreign intelligence agencies to Democratic Party apparatchiks to even people who are part of the Israeli state or Hamas. Um,
So
so
let me comment on something real quick before we move on to that, which is, you pointed out that there might be a contradiction between the market fundamentalism and the nationalism.
right.
And, like off the bat, that seems true. But what's happening in the world is there's a growing, globally, there's a growing nationalist nexus, so to speak, where you have multiple nationalist entities that are embracing one another and supporting each other as sort of like a new order of more nationally oriented entities. And that sort of makes it more like you don't have this like international institutions governing states at the national level. You have sort of a federation of nationalist states. And that's what I think is going on there. And it sort of changes that dynamic of the market fundamentalism.
Well, yeah, I don't. necessarily disagree. I don't fully understand how that is working itself out.
Well,
Because
because
give
if
me an
you
example.
if you conceptualize a country or a state as basically a corporation, then you start looking at countries as competing entities.
Hmm.
And instead of seeing like the economy as an international, transnational thing,
Hmm.
you're, I mean, you still are, but you have this mediating layer of nation states acting as corporations, as economic entities. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that that was the case in the neoliberal era and the Fordist era as well. It's just a matter of what kinds of agreements are drawn up between the nation states and what sorts of organizations are regulating the
well,
market. So, like,
yeah.
for instance, like the EU consists of a variety, a bunch of different nations with their own languages, but now one currency. And the EU is set up to regulate the trade agreements and relations between those nations. But, and the nations voluntarily join the EU in an effort to supposedly benefit the collective national and continental interests or regional interests of those nations, right? And that's what the EU was for. So it's both a nationalist and an internationalist uh, project, um, but it's a regional project.
Well,
Um, Go ahead.
oh, and what's interesting about this to me is that it actually is a little bit more true to, I think, Woodrow Wilson, who you mentioned, that had so much to do with forming the international state system and promoting business and promoting this sort of free market nationalism that America has kind of been known for. So
Hmm.
it almost harkens back to something from the past, even though it seems so new. And I think the difference when it comes to the globalists is like you see people from the Democratic Party or like, I don't know, they might say Davos or something. They like, they want international or global law. They want the ICC, the ICJ, and institutions like that to have more power. And I don't think that's the case with the nationalists.
Right. Well, so from my American perspective, I am glad to see a nationalist movement arise then because the EU would have give itself the power to impose speech laws on the rest of the world that would limit speech in the United States and violate my constitutional right. The Digital Services Act specifically sets up moderation policies for private social media companies that
Hmm.
which would censor or moderate speech in the United States, limiting your ability to be critical of the proxy war in Ukraine, as an example. So I would oppose that, and if you are a nation with strong protections for society as against the state, like we supposedly have here with the Bill of Rights, then returning to a national order rather than an international one might be in the interest of socialism, even because it would liberate the people in society to organize politically.
I
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that depends on what socialists wind up being capable of doing to begin with.
right.
I
Well,
mean, and
sure.
so,
I mean, if we
but
abandon the project of socialism, right? If we just say, well, socialism's off the table, we're not going to be able to organize politically, then at that point, I guess it becomes a matter of choosing your poison, maybe.
uh,
It's like, right? Would you rather have the EU be the boot on your neck or some unitary executive do it? And that
right,
gets us to this question of the current attack on free speech rights in the United States that is coming from the new, liberator of America from the global order, and the
Yeah.
one who wants to reset the stage.
Yeah. So I think, part of what gets difficult in the conversation about free speech is not starting from the beginning, and which is what speech was in colonial America and what the framers of the Constitution argued why it needed to be protected to begin with. And what they were arguing was that speech was important because it was part of the deliberative process, right? It was part of deliberating what the laws should be. And it came out of the Enlightenment value of reason and rational discourse and
Mm-hmm.
rational deliberation. So, what they were protecting really was the ability for a democratic society to deliberate and do that in a rational way. And that's like the spirit of that protection. But there's a contradiction when you start talking about free speech in the abstract. And that is, in order to protect something, it needs to be controlled. So in order for the government to protect speech, it needs to control speech in some way. And that gets you into a paradox. And
That
you
paradox just doesn't arise in the United States because the state is not in the business of protecting people's right to speak. That's not what it does. It has
right,
a, is explicitly barred from controlling speech or imposing any limits on speech. But it is not getting into the business of making sure everyone has an equal access to speech or that everyone has a positive right to speak. That's
right,
worked out by society itself rather than the state. So what it is that the First Amendment just says the state will pass no laws and implement no regulations, impose no penalties on anyone on the basis of their speech. So when um, uh, Spencer Leonard says Mahmoud Khalil's free speech rights haven't been curtailed, he can still publish his views in America. That may be true, and yet at the same time, the First Amendment has been violated because the state has overreached and violated its own constitutional basis by imposing a penalty on Mahmoud Khalil on the basis of the content of his speech. So you don't have to ban someone's publications in order to violate their free speech rights or the free speech rights of society, which is really what's being violated here, not just Mahmoud Khalil's speech rights, but just by penalizing someone for the content of their speech, from having the state penalize someone based on the ideas that they espouse and nothing else. That is when you are violating the principle of the First Amendment.
I don't. I'm going to abandon the point I was making earlier. Maybe we can come back to it. But
Come back to yeah.
I think I'm a little bit more on Spencer in the chat, talking about the basis of the speech being the basis of his persecution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, this is where I think it gets pretty damn complicated because Marco Rubio has kind of made the argument that it is, in fact, the things that he is speaking and saying, right? I didn't write down the quote, and that would be evidence that his uh, deportation is a result of targeting him for speech. But besides that, the evidence, in my opinion, points more towards this being about targeting him because he's an immigrant. And because he's not really an important figure in the pro-Palestine movement. He's not really like leading any movements. Um, so that's on the targeting him part of it. But then as far as like evenly applying free speech curtailments, you don't see other people getting targeted for their speech. So, except for one who we don't have details about, in addition to uh, Khalil.
Hmm.
So, I think this has a lot more to do with targeting immigrants, especially because I think 300 MS-13 and the other gang members are set to be deported right now at the same time as this is happening. And I think it's also targeting universities. And this is an additional way to attack the university system, especially universities that don't comply with what Trump wants, in addition to DEI and things like that, and an anti-immigrant measure.
Right. So so when it comes to immigration, you're absolutely right that this is just a part of the overall policy of cracking down on immigrants, and really that means at this point both legal immigrants and illegal immigrants, because Trump is going after people who are in the process of getting green cards. He is setting up ICE agents in airports to check on the legal status of people, so to find out if they are in any way in violation. So, for instance, if their visa has expired because they are in the process of applying for a green card, they're in this sort of legal limbo and they can be deported in that moment, despite the fact that the regulations would stipulate that, you don't deport someone when they're in the process of applying for a green card. They can be deported. So like they have the wiggle room to deport people while they're in that limbo between having a visa and having a green card. And that happens because if you apply for renewing your visa at the same time that you apply for a green card, it can create confusion. And if your visa is turned down, it can actually alert ICE that you are in violation of your visa status, and they can deport you even as you're trying to get your green card. So people just apply often enough just for the green card, and don't extend their visa. Um, in any case, so they're looking for every loophole they can to throw
Yes,
people out of the country. That's
right,
true. And so the other point on about the attack on the university system, that's happening as well. Absolutely. Um, and that might be happening for a variety of reasons. I mean, the obviously Trump is motivated to go after the institutions which were most closely aligned with his political enemies, the Democrats, for one. But the
right.
other part of it, I think, and this is something I'm working on with David Shields now to try to co-write an essay about this, is that as we shift away from the neoliberal order, which was domestically founded on the promise of a post-industrial society where intellectual workers would be the dominant form for workers to be, that there'll be a dominant identity. Um, so, the new creative class was held up as a aspirational goal for young people in the 90s and early 2000s. Um, and, the service economy was going to keep us afloat. Um, and we in 2000 there was even a thought that all the old rules were gone. You didn't actually have to produce anything in order to make a profit. You didn't have to have a productive economy. um, and that has been put to bed over the last a decade and a half. And so there's a need to change the foundation of work, and the foundation of the U.S. economy, onshore productive, our productive capacity, bring in manufacturers, and stop investing in higher education on the scale that we were, because it's not going to be for everybody going forward. It's so uh, you know the, we're proletarianizing the working class by attacking the university system in this way. Um, And as a socialist, I have mixed feelings about that. If like, like proletarianizing the workers, like getting rid of the illusion of some social mobility through education, is that necessarily a bad thing for socialists? Well, it depends. I mean, it's not a great thing for people to have less access to education. Certainly not. But the restructuring of the American economy on this basis, if that's what's happening, might be an opportunity for us. So I like I said, I'm ambivalent about that aspect of Trump's agenda. Um, but but we also, when we look at something like the case with Mahmoud Khalil, can't we don't have the power to try to do everything through one issue, and we should think about what our primary interests are in this case. And I think for us, the primary interests come down to emancipating society as much as we can and making demands that are in our that are in our immediate interest right away. So Spencer Leonard says the issue is section 212A3C3 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And if I'm remembering correctly, that section says that if an immigrant espouses support for a terrorist organization or encourages others to do so, he can be deported. And that came
Right.
out of the Patriot Act after the attacks of 9/11. That was part of the Patriot Act after 9/11. So, from my old man perspective, that's a relatively recent addition to the constitutional order, not something set in stone, and something that we should have already gotten rid of, given that the war on terror has at least faded from being dominant and perhaps ended even. And we never, yeah, we never should have had that happen. It was not justified in the context of the war on terror. But now I don't see any political justification for it.
So on the other hand, there's for all that, there's also the problem of um actually proving that this guy advocated that stuff at all anyway. Because when you start digging into his role, he was part of the Columbia University Apartheid Divest, or CUAD. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not a centralized organization, it's just a coalition of like 89 different groups that came together under the banner of trying to divest from Israel, trying to
Mm-hmm.
get their universities to stop funding. So he's getting blamed for things any number of people attached to that effort have done. But I haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen any evidence that he advocated for Hamas. Um, Very loose arguments that he supported armed struggle because of his affiliation with this coalition, but it's just really flimsy. So, uh, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are trying to make that case that he's not even really important in that movement, and he's not very much of an outspoken representative of it.
Yeah, well, the question of whether or not he has advocated for Hamas is uh, kind of secondary, um, right? I mean, and the degree to which he's being blamed for things that other people did, that would come up, I suppose, if he was given a fair hearing, which he may not be because of the way immigration law
Sure.
works. His lawyer has appealed. Um, but I'm interested in uh, what will happen to him, and I do think it is a political question, not just a legal question. So,
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah. So, how do we, like, what will the consequences for the Trump administration be if they proceed in deporting him, and will those consequences be enough to shift their position, um, and or not? But on the legal question, Spencer said that I'm wrong about what the 1182A3C3, um, where that comes from, uh, and what it says. And I have read that a section of code that does talk about espousing um, support for terrorists. And I don't think that I don't know if we're really talking about the different parts of the code or not, because it would put this in the hands of the Secretary of State. Um, but I'll have to look into it later. Maybe I can leave a comment on that or something in the description for this video to settle whether or not Spencer is correct that it just gives the Secretary of State the right to deport anyone that he decides is a threat to national security for any reason, or whether or not it does delineate reasons, including espousing um, the support for terrorist organizations. Because if it does include that, then by removing it, we would remove one of the reasons that a Secretary of State could use to deport someone, and also by having a list of possible reasons for the Secretary of State to deport someone, it sets some standards. It regulates that decision. It defines it. It rather than just saying, "Oh yeah, the Secretary of State, if he gets up on the wrong side of the bed and has a dream, let's say that the Secretary of State has a dream that Mahmoud Khalil is going to stage a terrorist attack in Portland, Oregon, and blow up the Lloyd Center Mall. That would not be justification for him deporting Mahmoud Khalil, right? Because that wouldn't be sufficient grounds. That wouldn't fit within the code. Um, so I do think it. On the one hand, it's a political decision, but on the other hand, we shouldn't ignore what the law says. So I'll try to figure out what it actually says in between streams, maybe here. Um, but what of the fact, though, that Mahmoud Khalil has at least been tied and worked for uh, some soft power efforts made by the UK's Foreign Office.
So I heard
And
you mention that, and I'm not familiar with that at all. So maybe you can elaborate on that because you talked a little bit about it in your intro.
yeah, um, this has been reported by the Middle East Eye. Uh, Came out um, 6 days ago. He was given security clearance by the um, the Foreign Office as he worked for the embassy in Beirut. Um, Here, I'll read an excerpt from this article in the Middle East Eye. Um, let's see. Former British diplomat Andrew Waller, who was a policy advisor at the Syria office while Khalil worked there, told the Middle East Eye that the U.S. government's depiction of Khalil was false and defamatory. He went through a vetting process to get the job and was cleared to work on sensitive issues for the British government, Waller said. It's outright defamation what Trump has done. Mahmoud is an extremely kind and conscientious person, and he was loved by his colleagues at the Syria office, he added. You couldn't find anyone who'd say a bad word about him. He was very good at his job. The Chevening Scholarship, which is funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, describes its mission as being to support UK foreign policy priorities and achieve FCDO objectives by creating lasting positive relationships with future leaders, influencers, and decision makers. Waller described it as a flagship UK soft power policy. It brings the brightest students from around the world to UK universities. Mahmoud ran its Syria program and interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants on behalf of the British government.
Hmm.
Khalil was also a local staff political officer responsible for providing the contextual understanding and linguistic skills to translate meetings, Waller recalled. It, yeah.
So it sounds like what he was working for the embassy and he was working for the embassy in Beirut, and they have
Mhm.
a an agreement with the with the British government to try to get students from there over to Britain. Was that the
Right. It was,
idea?
yeah, it was a scholarship program to develop leaders that would be aligned with UK interests in the region.
Why did he wind up at Columbia instead? Is there anything
No,
about that?
that's not. No, it doesn't say. Perhaps he went to Columbia, for his uh, graduate level degree. I mean, maybe he worked on this program as an undergraduate.
Yeah, it's interesting. It also, yeah, who knows? It kind of sounds like maybe this is an early job he got into because he wanted to get close to political jobs, right? Working for an embassy, getting experience in that field. I don't know if it really says a lot
Well,
about him being an asset.
the other part of the job, or one of the other things, we're running out of that agency through the same uh, agency within the British government. Had I forget what the name of it was now. I think I mentioned it in my essay, but I did. It was the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which he did some work on as well, and that was aimed at creating security in the region and directing funds to various political actors in the region. And that fund had been criticized for providing money to Al Qaeda.
Hmm.
Uh, so when you see those things, all those things together, it's a project to develop leaders that are sympathetic to UK or British interests in the region, and it was an attempt to fund political actors in the so that they would operate within the interests of the UK as well, and which also by extension means the US. Uh,
Right.
and then a little bit about how the United States has related to all sorts of political actors around the world, including Hamas. Um, you realize that being a part of a program to project soft power in the Middle East means being a part of a program that will be in some way or another entwined with some terrorist organizations. Ultimately, these things that you're not gonna keep your hands clean when
Um,
you do these kinds of operations through an organization like the USAID in the United States, or this let's see, what is it called again? The Conflict Stability and Security Fund.
uh, okay. I'm having
Yeah.
trouble making the connection. So are we thinking that he came from one of these terrorist organizations and got that
No,
job?
no,
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
saying anything like that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that 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 he was working for a kind of an British intelligence program,
Yeah.
and that had connections to many different political operatives in the Middle East, and so that it goes back to the line from Debord. You want to make your revolutionaries into secret agents, and your secret agents into revolutionaries. Trying to work
So,
out just whose side anyone's on. It's a riddle wrapped in an enigma, surrounded
yeah,
by
yeah.
mystery. you know, but
Well,
but
so I
but
think what would Trump, what would him targeting this guy be in that context?
oh,
Why would that be his target? I can only
I
think
I'm
in
not assuming that he knew that about that.
okay.
I don't know if he did or not. But the point of raising that is to just demonstrate how the U.S. left is not like consciously necessarily infiltrated, but is just systematically entwined with the with intelligence communities around the world. Like you just
Oh,
throw a rock,
well,
hit a leftist at one of these protests, and you find out he worked for a soft power organization out of the
yeah. I
UK.
mean,
You know,
or here even. I mean, it's not even,
well, he was
that
in the United States. You go to Colombia, you go to the encampment, you point at somebody, and by chance they're a former UK soft power operative. I mean, I don't think
right.
that's a hyperbolic way of saying it, but it's also the truth. So that's not to say that I think he was given secret plans by Q to you know what I'm saying? But on the
Oh,
other hand, he might have been. I don't know. You know, like my the novelist in me would certainly write it that way if I were writing this story.
poor
Um,
Q.
yeah,
Where's Q these days?
yeah,
Um, yeah. So, I mean, the left. So should we just talk about the left at this
yeah. Let's
point? I
talk.
mean,
Yeah, let's talk about the left for a little bit.
the left, in Trump's first term, Black Lives Matter was the big protest movement, along with Stop Cop City, right? I think that began under when Trump was in office. But it seems like the strategy that was developed to target Black Lives Matter, all that energy now is going into the targeting the pro-Palestine movement. But basically, it's targeting the left is the basic idea. And I think that's more significant than any kind of pro-Israel uh aspect of it, which is there
Mm.
for sure. But I think it's more opportunistic than actually strategic. So, as far as the left goes, I mean, the left has a really bad habit of playing into this stuff heavily, whether or not it has anything to do with intelligence communities. Um, and I think part of the way the left is playing into it now is to uh, think that this has more to do with ethno nationalism than it has to do with what I'm calling corporate nationalism.
Hmm.
And I think the motivations are far more economic than they are ethnic. So that kind of small change in worldview results in big changes in strategy when it comes to the left.
How so?
Well, you start calling Trump a fascist and trying to uh, link him up with white power movements and all these things that don't tend to stick to him very well. If you think that this has to do more with ethno nationalism, but if you think it has more to do with corporate nationalism and kleptocrats and things like that, you could see how he aligns more with Putin and Netanyahu in a capitalistic way, in an anti communist way. And I think it's that old anti communism that orientates a lot of this more than it is any kind of white supremacy, even though that's important.
I just, I okay. I want to say two things. My first reaction to that is we should really not ignore the fact that the so-called left, when you throw a rock, you hit a British intelligence agent. I'm not again. I'm being hyperbolic, but
Right.
but the other uh, thing I want to say is that we should be wary of defining our politics as being anti-Trump, whether or not it's because he's a white nationalist or uh, a corporate nationalist. We should
Hmm.
instead think about strategically what our political project in the short term might be about if we're going to be entering into the fray of capitalist politics at all. And if we are, I would propose that just sticking to defending the rights of everyone in the United States to be protected by the First Amendment would be the wisest move, and to try to see if the if it's true that the portion of the law that allows this to happen was developed out of the Patriot Act, and I do believe that there is such a law in the immigration code that did come out of the Patriot Act. Um, Seeking to have that rolled back, deleted, removed, would be a worthwhile reformist political project. Um,
Yeah.
if we wanted to spend our energy entering into the fray at all, if we didn't think it was too treacherous to even attempt to do so, which I think is actually the basis for the campaign, which the campaign for a socialist party would have us just really focus on building up connections within civil society for the possible future development of a party which could have a basis to intervene in a reformist manner, but without which it's too treacherous. We're just going to get fragmented and tossed about by forces
Well,
much larger than ourselves.
I'll say two things.
Yeah.
One, the Democratic Party really co-opted all that energy that came out of the post-Occupy movement and turned it into identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
Two, if we have an opportunity right now, I think it's looking at um, the sending people back to work, the attacks on remote work, and the way that's going to impact all sorts of people, whether they work for the federal government or states. There's actually a law that just passed the Arizona Senate that might impact me.
Mm.
For example, when it comes to that. And I think there's going to be some, labor backlash against that. There already is in California, where Gavin Newsom uh, gave out his order sending everyone back to work in the office. So that's an opportunity, and that could be some, might call it base building. I would call it, syndicalist organizing or something. But
Yeah, I would try not to call it base building or syndicalist organizing, but something else. Just so I would avoid the Maoist or anarchist connotations and just like
sure,
I don't know, yeah,
right.
try to do
But
something new, but obviously it could be thought of in either of those ways. Um, but I want to throw this quote from Steve Roberts on the screen. And by the way, I think we should wrap up in a minute because Steve and maybe hopefully Spencer and others will join us in a Zoom call, and I'll send you a link to that it'll be the Patreon portion
okay.
where patrons join in. But he says, how does political focus by trying to defend free speech and Khalil in particular, while the National Act is law? So how does one basically is asking like how do you have a political focus and how do you defend free speech while this is in the code? I believe is what he's asking. And um, any law has to be subject to the test of whether or not it's constitutional. And if it is found not to be in court, then it will be thrown out by the court. And further, I mean, the president, the executive, has the right to refuse to execute on laws that the Congress passes if he believes them to be unconstitutional. And then the way that will be worked out is in the courts. The public, society, also should and does have the right to refuse to follow or recognize laws that are unconstitutional and organize politically to oppose them. And, if we had a disciplined left, we might oppose this action on that basis and, be willing to be taken to court and but not just expect the courts to enact our will, but to organize society to petition the government in various ways to change the code to fit within our understanding, the general will's understanding of what the First Amendment is meant to be. And so that's how I would imagine that if we had a left, we would perhaps oppose the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, which we, if we had left, ought to do. Despite
I,
the fact that he's fucking James Bond.
all right.
So, all right. So why don't we wrap it up there, and then I'll see you in about 15 minutes in the Zoom call with the patrons.
Cool. All right.
And I want to tell everyone, Cyber Dandy here is the substitute teacher for Benjamin Studebaker. When Benjamin Studebaker can't make it, Cyber Dandy will be stepping in. I want you to treat him with the same respect as you would the regular co-host. Don't throw any spitballs. No paper airplanes. He's and anyway, I'll see you guys in the parrot room for the patrons.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,